So good evening. Thanks for joining us tonight. Take care of a few things on the screen. Get us back to where we need to be. We are in 2 Kings chapter 23, and I am glad you are joining in. Glad you are here tonight. There is a chat box on, if you put a comment in Facebook, I can see that. If you put a comment in the chat box on the website, I can see that as well. Just remember, you are watching about a minute and a half behind what I am doing. So if you put a question in there, it will give me, it'll take me a few minutes to see it, just the way technology works. But anyway, glad you're here and looking forward to covering 2 Kings chapter 23. There's some really cool things in 2 Kings chapter 23. And instead of reading most of that chapter, we are going to summarize and try to pull out some really great lessons from that. I am still reading from the New King James Version. That is just in case anybody who is watching will still do Bible Bowls. We're going to still use the New King James Version as we finish 2 Kings because that's what we started with. And we might as well go ahead and finish up using the same thing. I am going to turn off a couple of things there. And hey, again, thanks for being here. Now, to really get a good idea of what's happening in 2 Kings chapter 23, I want to go back just a moment to 2 Kings chapter 22. So in 2 Kings chapter 22, Josiah becomes acquainted with the law of God. And I think I may have a slide out of order here. Let me see. So it's the book of the covenant that he finds, and I thought I put a slide in there that I didn't, so let's just go back for a second. There's this really interesting thing that happens in 2 Kings chapter 22. So if you've got a Bible, you might grab your Bible and follow along. You'll also have it on the screen. I'll pull it up here so you can see 2 Kings chapter 23. So we're actually in 2 Kings chapter 22. So Hilkiah in verse 8 gave the book to Shaphan, and he read it. And Shaphan the scribe went to the king, bringing the king word, saying, "Your servants have gathered the money that was found in the house, and have delivered it into the hand of those who do the work, who oversee the house of the Lord." Then Shaphan the scribe showed the king, saying, "Hilkiah the priest has given me a book." And Shaphan read it before the king. And that book is the book of the law, or the book of the covenant. And in chapter 23, it is the record of how Josiah turns, with all of his heart to follow this book that he has found. But here's this really incredible thing in verse 11, chapter 22. He sends Hilkiah the priest and Ahikam the son of Shaphan and Akbor and Shaphan the scribe and Asaiah, who's a servant, and he sends them to inquire of God. And the interesting thing in verse 14, I just want to highlight. So Hilkiah the priest, Ahikam, Akbor, and Shaphan and Asaiah went to Huldah the prophetess, the wife of Salom, the son of Tikva, the son of Harhas, the keeper of the wardrobe, and she dwelt in Jerusalem in the second quarter. Now, after we finish 2 Kings, we are going to do a Wednesday night study on incredible women of the Bible, and Huldah is one of the ladies who will be in that study. So that's just kind of a teaser of some things that are coming up. But she is such an incredible lady, and when you think about what happened in those passages, there are some contemporaneous prophets with Huldah who are, when you read their names, they are really heavy hitters. There's Nahum and Zephaniah and Habakkuk and Jeremiah. And when the king sends word to inquire of God, they don't go to any of those four prophets. They go to Huldah, the prophetess. And just kind of looking forward to sharing that with you in a couple of weeks. There will be 4 weeks where we will study in September incredible women of the Bible. So what has happened is Josiah has been given the book of the law, the book of the covenant, and he has read that, and in chapter 23 is how he determines that he is going to follow that book of the law and follow God and renew the covenant that God made with them. So we're going to start in 2 Kings chapter 23, and we'll read through some of that. So if you got a Bible, follow along. If not, just you can look at the screen and you can read along with me. So the king sends out and he gathers all of the elders of Judah and Jerusalem, and he goes to the house of the Lord with all of the men of the Judah and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem and the priests and the prophets. And it's great. He says, all of the people from great until small. Now remember, if you've got questions, throw them in that text box, throw them on the Facebook comment page, chat page, or throw them on the website, and I'll try to grab them from there. But remember, you're about a minute and a half behind me. But so he reads, and they're hearing all of the books of the law. So it's everybody who he's associated with, and it's interesting from the smallest to the greatest. So every human being. And he stands beside the pillar in verse 3, and I have no idea. What that means. He stands beside a pillar. Some have suggested that there was like a platform that he would have stood on, or a higher elevated section of some kind. Maybe he just stood beside a pillar. It's just hard to know exactly what that means. But he stands on this pillar and he makes this covenant with the Lord to follow the Lord, to keep his commandments. And this is in verse 3. Follow the Lord, to keep his commandments and his testimonies and his statutes with all his heart and soul, and to perform the words of the covenant that were written in this book. And all the people took a stand for the covenant. So that they're all making this covenant with God. And he does these incredible things when he starts to renew that covenant with God. So I just want to look at some of these. You'll have to read 2 Kings chapter 23 to get all the details. So I'm not going to do that for you. So you'll have to kind of read through that to get the details. So the book of the covenant, just quickly first, and I'm sorry I kind of skipped over this. The book of the covenant is mentioned in Exodus chapter 24, verse 7. It says, then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, all that the Lord has said we will do, and we will be obedient. And Moses took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, this is the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you according to all these words. And that's at the conclusion of starting in Exodus chapter 20, where there are the 10 commandments, all the way until the end of the law in the book of Exodus. And all of that is kind of encompassed in this book called the Book of the Covenant. And in the book, and so the only other time the Book of the Covenant is actually mentioned in the text is 2 Kings chapter 23, which we're reading tonight, and 2 Chronicles chapter 34, which is the companion passage to 2 Kings chapter 23. So it's obvious that this goes back to the law that God gave to Moses on Mount Sinai, and that he shared with the people of Israel. It had the blessings and the covenants, and it's where the Israelites said, we will follow this covenant with God. And Josiah has read this book of the covenant, and he knows that the people have not followed this covenant. And he says, and he is going to turn with all of his heart to God. And that's what Josiah exemplifies in these passages. One who turns with all of his heart to God. So here's what he does. You know, the first thing, here's the first lesson, and we'll see how it's used with Josiah. Do not allow ungodly things in God's temple. Now, if you remember, first they had the tabernacle, right? Because they were traveling in the wilderness. And after the tabernacle, David wanted to build God a house. And God said, David, you can't build my house, but your son can build a house. So Solomon builds the temple. And the temple is dedicated to service to God. It has the holy place, has the courtyards on the outside, and the holy place, and then the most holy place. The place where God has chosen for his name to dwell, where in the cloud and between the wings of the cherubim, he made his presence known. And I mean, I know that we know God is everywhere, right? But God chose at that time to kind of make his presence known in that temple, in the the holy, the most holy place, the holiest of holies. And the incredible thing is when you get to 2 Kings chapter 23, when we start looking at the text, they have put all of these idols, these idols to other gods and this worship of other gods, and they have placed those all around God's temple. And if you look just quickly with me in verse 23, it says, "And the king commanded Hilkiah the high priest and the priest of the second order and the doorkeepers to bring out of the temple of the Lord all the articles that were made for Baal, for Asherah, and for all the host of heaven." So they were worshiping the sun and the stars and the moon. "And he burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of Kidron and carried their ashes to Bethel." And we're going to come back to Bethel in just a minute. It has to do with the sins of Jehoshaphat. We'll get to that, okay? Not Jehoshaphat, Jeroboam. But there's a reason that he carries them to Bethel when all of this happens, and we'll go through that when we get there. But they've got all of these idols that are, in verse 6, the wooden image from the house of the Lord to the brook Kidron outside Jerusalem, and burned it at the brook Kidron, and ground it to ashes, and threw it on the graves of the common people. The ritual booths that were in the house of the Lord, where the women wove hangings for the wooden image, which was the Asherah. And these high places that were at the gates of the entrance of Joshua, the governor of the city. So there's all of these things that are inside God's temple. So I just made a list of them so you quickly see what they were. I need to watch all the time here. So there was articles to Baal, who was a Canaanite god, the chief of the Canaanite gods. There were articles to Asherah. There were articles in the temple of the Lord to the host of heaven, which would be the sun, the moon, the stars, the planets. There were the ritual booths, which are translated in the New King James Version. You'll see different translations of that in other translations, but we won't get into that for the sake of Bible Bowl. The women who wove the hangings for Asherah, and we're not really sure what that means exactly, or at least I'm not really sure what that means. There are these idol horses that are just outside the temple that he talks about in 2 Kings chapter 23. And then you have some altars that are on the roof of the temple, and then there are altars in the two courts of the temple. So if you can just imagine walking into where God's temple was at that time in Jerusalem, and you have all of these things to all of these false gods, where God had plainly said in that book of the covenant, "You shall have no other gods before me," and not to worship other gods. That's in the book of the covenant. You've got all of these gods who are scattered all around the temple, and Josiah is the king who comes through, and he wipes all of those out. He removes all of them. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul writes, "Don't you know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit lives in you?" So instead of having a temple like in Jerusalem, we are God's temple, both corporately as the church and individually. "If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him, for God's temple is sacred, and you are that temple." I just want to challenge you for a second to think about something. We read, like in the temple in the time of Josiah, and we would think, how in the world, with all that God had done for them, how could they bring all of those foreign gods, how could they bring all of those idols into God's temple? And the challenge for us is if you don't catch that, the challenge is after all God has done for you, how can you allow idols, false gods, to be part of your temple? That you cleanse the temple and you keep it clean and you keep it pure, that you don't allow ungodly things in God's temple. And I thought in terms of that, like if you turn over, let me get the Bible up here again. If you go over to Galatians chapter 5 verse 19, Now the works of the flesh are evident: sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy, drunkenness, orgies, and things like these. I warn you, as I warned you before, that those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. So if you want to keep your temple pure, if you want to keep your temple holy for worship to God, you need to keep those things that are the works of the flesh out of your temple. And we read that list, and some of those things I think, okay, I'm pretty good with those. And some of those on that list, I think, I'm not really as good as I should be at keeping those things out. Fits of anger and rivalries and dissensions and divisions and envy. I don't know what your challenge is. I don't know what the thing is that you struggle with the most. And I can't decide that for you. That's something you must decide for yourself. But if you think in terms of God's temple, not just individually, but also corporately, your body is God's temple, and the body of the church as God's temple. Think about what you need to do to keep that temple pure, to keep those things out of the temple that don't need to be in the temple. So don't allow ungodly things in God's temple. And when we sit and we think, well, we'd never put Baal or Asherah or the host of heaven or any of those other gods they worship, we would never do that. Well, we do in our own way when we don't keep sin and impurity out of our bodies and out of our presence. So don't allow ungodly things in the temple. And in Josiah's credit, the first thing that Josiah does is he cleanses the temple. He gets all of the evil, all of the idols, all of the things to other gods, everything that's dedicated to another god. And those who serve other gods, he pulls those and removes those from the temple so he doesn't allow ungodly things in the temple. And then it's not just the temple itself, but it's the area around the temple. So don't allow ungodly things in proximity to God's temple. So the second thing Josiah did is not things that are in the temple itself, but things that are close to the temple or around the temple or close to the people who are supposed to be worshiping God. So we can read this in the text. You can read this in 2 Kings chapter 23. But here are some of the things that he does. He removes all of the idolatrous priests. He removes the high places, and there are high places in the cities of Judah. There are high places around Jerusalem. There's even mentions one specifically that's at the entrance of the gate of Joshua. And Joshua is not the Joshua of the Old Testament, but he is Joshua who is, I'd have to go back and look exactly, but he's like a city, he's a governor of the city, is the way as he's described. Topheth, which was an area outside of Jerusalem. It's in the valley of Hinnom. And in the valley of Hinnom, in Topheth, is where they had the fire to Molech, where they would actually make sons and daughters pass through the fire, and probably to be understood as human sacrifice. If you look at a map with me just really quickly, it would have been, this area that you would have found those, and then you would have found, all around Jerusalem and around these walls, you would have found these idols, these places that were dedicated to other gods. He goes to the Mount of Corruption, which is south, which is a part actually of the Mount of Olives, if I figure that right. And on the Mount of Corruption is where Solomon had built a place for Ashtaroth, which is a goddess of the Sidonians, for Chemosh, which is the god of the Moabites, and Milcom, who was the god of Ammon. And remember, Solomon married foreign women, and he built high places for worship to their god, and those were considered to be the Mount of Corruption. Some other translations have Mount of Destruction. It's kind of a word that means a snare, which is what it became. It became a place where people were entrapped to worship other gods. He goes to Bethel, and he removes the high places at Bethel. We're going to come back to that in just a second. And he goes to Samaria, and he removes all of the high places of Samaria. So he doesn't just go into the temple and cleanse the temple. He goes into all the area around Jerusalem and past Jerusalem, and even into Judah and further north into Samaria. And he's removing all of the high places where they have worshiped and served other gods. And just a great lesson in there. If you follow along with that. Hang on just a second, I lost my cursor. All through 2 Kings, we have heard about the sin of Jeroboam. The sin of Jeroboam. He followed the sins of his father Jeroboam. 20 times it is said about a king or about the Israelites that they followed after the sins of Jeroboam. So in 2 Kings 23, moreover, the altar that was at Bethel, the high place which Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who made Israel sin, had made, both that altar and the high place he broke down and burned the high place, crushed it to powder, and burned the wooden image. So all of those times in 2 Kings, we have heard about the sins of Jeroboam. Josiah goes to the high place and he destroys it. And I love that section where it says, not only did he burn it, he crushed it to powder. And that's just so cool. And those things that are in our life that maybe they're not within us, but they're on the edges. You know, those things that can tempt us and lead us astray, those things that can grab our attention. So during all of this, let's go back to the text really quick. I'm sorry, I'm jumping around on you a lot, so just kind of hang on. But during all of this, here in verse 16, as Josiah turned, he saw the tombs that were on the mountain, and he sent and took the bones out of the tombs and burned them on the altar and defiled it according to the word of the God, which the man of God proclaimed, to proclaim these words. Then he said, what gravestone is that I see? And the men of the city told him, it is the tomb of the man of God who came from Judah and proclaimed these things which you have done against the altar of Bethel. And I want to go back to that story just really quickly for a second. Now, there is something in this chapter. He goes through and he keeps on all of the altars, all of the high places. It says he burns bones, and it goes back to 1 Kings chapter 13. If you want to turn your Bible there, just read here on the screen. There's this. Let's go back to chapter 13, verse 1. Hang on just a second. Let me get our Bible in a good place here. There is a man of God. Jeroboam has built this high place, the one that all through 2 Kings we have heard followed the sins of Jeroboam. And so Jeroboam builds this altar to make sacrifices, and he does that because he's afraid if the Israelites go back to Jerusalem and worship God there, that their hearts will turn back to Rehoboam and he will lose his part of the kingdom, which God has already given him. But if he had trusted in God and not done this, everything probably would have been fine. So he builds this high place, and so God sends a prophet. And the prophet comes out. Behold, a man of God came out of Judah by the word of the Lord to Bethel, and Jeroboam was standing by the altar to make offerings. Okay, this is the altar that he's built in Bethel. And the man cried against the altar by the word of the Lord and said, O altar, altar, thus says the Lord, behold, a son shall be born to the house of David, Josiah by name, and he shall sacrifice on you the priest of the high places, who make offerings on you, and human bones shall be burned on you. And he gave a sign the same day, saying, this is the sign that the Lord has spoken. Behold, the altar shall be torn down, and the ashes that are on it shall be poured out. And when the king heard the saying of the man of God, which he cried out against the altar at Bethel, Jeroboam stretched out his hand from the altar and said, seize him. And his hand which he stretched out against him dried up, so that he could not draw it back to himself, and the altar was torn down, and the ashes poured out from the altar, according to the sign that the man of God had given by the word of the Lord. Now, if you read on through 1 Kings there, Jeroboam has the prophet pray for him. He prays for them. He restores his hand. The king says, "Hey, come home with me. I'll give you a reward." And he said, "If you gave me half of your house, I wouldn't go home with you, because I was not eat bread or drink water, because it was commanded by the word of the Lord that you should neither eat bread or drink water, or return by the same way." And if you remember this story, this is an incredible story in the Old Testament. There is an old prophet who lives in Bethel, who hears about the prophet who came, and he sends a message to him by his sons. The prophet turns back. He goes to the house of the old prophet, and because he disobeyed, when he left, he was killed. In verse 24, a lion met him on the road and killed him. And so the old prophet went and got the body of the younger prophet and buried him. And in verse 31, after he had buried him, he said to his sons, "When I die, bury me in the grave in which the man of God is buried. Lay my bones beside his bones, for the saying that he called out by the word of the Lord against the altar in Bethel and against all the houses of the high places that are in the cities of Samaria shall surely come to pass." So when we get back over here to 2 Kings chapter 23, and Josiah sees the bones and the tombs, it is those two prophets that he sees the tombstone of. And so he says, "Let him alone, let no one move his bones." So they let his bones alone with the bones of the prophet who came from Samaria. So I just want to make sure that you get that connection between 2 Kings chapter 23 and 1 Kings chapter 13, because God had prophesied that this was going to happen. So if we go back to our to PowerPoint here, so we covered 1 Kings chapter 13. Again, don't you know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit lives in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him, for God's temple is sacred and you are that temple. So what I would encourage you to do, based on, okay, so he cleansed the temple, then he went to all the areas around the temple, tore down all of the high places, all of the things that they were worshiping, all the things that could cause them to sin. So if there are things that are just outside of your temple, but you know there are things that really give you problems, there are things that maybe you've worshipped in the past, or maybe things that have grabbed your attention in the past, things that you've struggled with in the past. I mean, it could be greed, it could be pornography, it could be a relationship you've had with someone. It could be a whole host of things. But I would encourage you, cleanse the things that are in the vicinity of God's temple, as well as the things that are in God's temple. Don't allow ungodly things in proximity to God's temple, and don't just keep them at an arm's length and say, "Well, you know, they really don't bother me now." Take really decisive action. I mean, Josiah could have said, "We know they're not really in the temple of the Lord. They're kind of out on the outskirts. We'll just kind of let those stay." But he didn't. He took really decisive action. Remove everything that challenges your covenant that you have made with God. If anything threatens that covenant, then you remove that out of the way. You remove that. And so the next thing he does, so now he's cleansed the temple, he's taken care of all of the altars, all of the high places, Topeth, the stuff that's in the valley of Hinnom, and he's crushed all of those. I mean, he's crushed them down to dust, and he's removed all of those. Then he comes back, and I kind of put this under removing temptations. He removes those who, let me see if I can find these verses for you. So if we come down to 2 Kings chapter 23, moreover, verse 24, moreover Josiah put away all those who consulted mediums and spiritists, the household gods and idols, all the abominations that were seen in the land of Judah and in Jerusalem, but that he might perform the words of the law which were written in the book that Hilkiah the priest found in the house of the Lord. Now before him there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might, according to the law of Moses, nor did any arise like him. So what he removes when he does that is those who consult mediums, the spiritists, household gods, household idols, all abominations. So he just didn't remove all of the public places. He went in and helped remove all of the private places, the houses, the gods that they would keep in the house, or the idols that they would keep in the house, those who they would consult. And you know from the Old Testament, those who consult mediums and spiritists should be put to death. And in all of this, Josiah dedicates himself and turns all of the people back to this covenant that they had made with God. So Josiah removed everything which would conflict with loyalty to God. And that is a great principle. You know, I think, you know, myself included, if there are things in your life that conflict with loyalty to God, we need to understand what those are. And maybe we need to put those away. Maybe that, you know, we need to remove those, and so we can dedicate ourselves to serving God and following him. You know, we have loyalties in life, and some of them are God-given. You know, we have loyalty to family. We have responsibility to family. We have responsibility to work. If a man's not going to work, he shouldn't eat. You know, you're supposed to work with your hands, not so that you can store up, but so you can share with somebody who has a need, which is what Paul writes in Ephesians. So it's not that you just push everything away, but you know, those responsibilities that you have, or those things that tempt you that aren't godly in your life, you move those out of the way and you honor the things that God has put in your life so that you can worship and serve him. So that'd be my challenge to you, is to remove everything which would conflict with loyalty to the covenant that you have made with God. Now the next thing that Josiah does is not only does he remove all of those out, but then he celebrates God. He celebrates who God is. If you go back to 1 Kings chapter 23, let me get the Bible back to the right passage. Verse 21, then the king commanded all the people, saying, keep the Passover to the Lord your God, as it is written in the book of the covenant. And such a Passover surely had never been held since the days of the judges who judged Israel, nor in the days of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. And in the 18th year of Josiah, this Passover was held before the Lord in Jerusalem. So the other thing that Josiah does is he celebrates God. The Passover is a celebration, a remembrance, how God led them out of Egypt and delivered them from slavery, and he called them to be his people. So not only do you remove the things that take you away from God, but find time in your life to celebrate God. Celebrate the good things that God has done for you. One way we do that is worship. When we worship together on Sunday, we are celebrating God. And worship just isn't just a time of day. It's not an hour on Sunday. You worship and celebrate God every moment of your life, every second of your life. You're celebrating God. But find those moments to celebrate God. Stop. Thank God for what he's done. Thank God for the way he's blessed you. Thank God for the way he's forgiven your sin. Thank God for the way that he helps you. Just find time, place to celebrate God. One of the greatest ways we celebrate God is in communion, when we celebrate the covenant and we remember the body and the blood of Jesus and his sacrifice and his gift, and that he is the first fruit of those who's risen from the dead, and the eternal life that he's placed within us, and the incredible grace and love and mercy and salvation he's extended to us. So celebrate God. And that's what Josiah does. He doesn't just remove the bad stuff, but he celebrates the God with whom he's made his covenant. And also this, make a covenant with God. Have you made a covenant with God? You make a covenant with God through Jesus Christ. You do that through confession, repentance, baptism, piety, and you make this covenant with God, and you become one with God, and God becomes one with you. You declare that you want God, you want him to be your God, and he chooses for you to be his family, his son or his daughter. So make a covenant with God, honor that covenant, and then celebrate that covenant that you made with him. Now, we get other things that happen in the text as we go through this. God doesn't turn from his fierce anger because of Manasseh, who is a king before, a couple of kings before Josiah, and he's still determined that he is going to remove Judah from his sight because of the sin, and because he's going to remove his name from the city, which he said, my name will dwell there. So Josiah, at about 39 years of age, he was 8, I think he reigned 31 years. Y'all might check me on that. I'm kind of going from memory, but I think he would have been 39. He goes out to fight against Pharaoh Necho, who is the king of Egypt. And the king of Egypt is coming to aid of the king of Assyria. So, you got these world powers who are going to battle with each other. Babylon is going to come up right before this. So Pharaoh Necho goes out to aid the king of Assyria. And in his aiding of the king of Assyria at the river Euphrates, King Josiah goes against him, and they meet in battle at Megiddo. And let me show you a map really quickly, if I can. Megiddo would have been in this area right up here. If you can see that, there's where Megiddo would have been. And so in a battle at Megiddo, he loses his life. Pharaoh Necho kills Josiah at Megiddo when he confronted him, and they bring Josiah back to Jerusalem in a chariot, and they bury him in his own tomb. And Jehoahaz, who is the son of Josiah, they anoint him and make him king in his father's place. He's 23 years old when he becomes king, but he only reigns for 3 months. And it's interesting, and there's a lesson. As great a king as Josiah was, and the way that he turned to God, what it says about Jehoahaz is he did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not follow his father's example. But Jehoahaz becomes king. Pharaoh Necho puts him in prison at Riblah, which is north of Jerusalem. It's I'm not going to try to show you that on the map. It's in the land of Hamath, and he did that so he couldn't reign in Jerusalem. And later he takes him from there all the way back down to Egypt, and he actually dies in Egypt. We find out in verse 34. Pharaoh took Jehoahaz and went to Egypt, and he died there. And he puts this tribute on the land: 100 talents of silver. Talents about 75 pounds, so that's 7,500 talents of silver, and pounds of silver, 7,500 pounds of silver, and 75 pounds of gold, 1 talent. So Jehoiakim gives the money to Pharaoh. So get this. Let me show you a slide to kind of help you with this, so we know where we're going with this. So Josiah was king, okay, and then Jehoahaz is king for just 3 months, and then Jehoiakim becomes king. And so we're right down to the last couple of kings of Israel of Judah before the Babylonian captivity. So Pharaoh Necho makes Jehoiakim king, and he extracts the money through tribute and tax so that he can give that to the king of Egypt. And Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he becomes king, and he reigns 11 years in Jerusalem, and he does evil in the sight of the Lord. So Josiah is a good king. His son does evil, and his son's son does evil. So in all of that, there's a lesson in there, but that's a lesson for another time. So make a covenant with God. So that's kind of 2 Kings chapter 23, kind of summed up fairly quickly. But there's this incredible lesson in there about making sure that you make a covenant with God and that you're loyal to that covenant. Maybe you made that covenant, maybe at one time, and and maybe you need to to think about the covenant that made you God. Maybe there are things in your life that you need to remove, things that you need to change, another course of action that you need to take. Maybe, like the Israelites, you've just gotten kind of accustomed to the culture that's around you, and you've just kind of gravitated to what culture says is okay instead of really focusing on the covenant and the word that God has given. Maybe there are things that kind of crept into your life that you need to remove and move those back out of the way so you can renew that covenant with God. We will do 2 Kings 24 next week. The week after that, 2 Kings 25. In September, we will start this class on incredible women of the Bible. I'll look see if you got any comments on here that I need to answer, any questions. After that, we're going to do a study on incredible women of the Bible. I'm really looking forward to that. It's going to be I think it's going to be a really great study. Sunday morning, we'll be live streaming at 10 o'clock. The hope of the gospel. The question is about what is the hope of the gospel during times of a pandemic and social unrest. So we'll be looking at the hope of the gospel within that context on Sunday morning. Hope you can join us for that. I really like this Asking for a Friend series, and there's some really incredible questions that you've submitted, and really looking forward to dealing with those on Sunday morning. We are hoping, if everything continues to progress the way that it is now, that the second Sunday of September, which I think is September the 13th, we will go back to having Sunday morning classes and children's church on Sunday morning as well. We are not going to resume in-person meeting on Wednesday night right now. Maybe soon in the future, but right now the plan is we'll continue to live stream on Sunday morning. So Sunday morning, please tune in for the hope of the gospel. You can find that ClarksvilleHighwayChurch.com, GospelChariot.church, 2 Facebook pages, Clarksville Highway Church Christ Gospel Chariot, and also a YouTube channel, Gospel Chariot. Hope you've learned something tonight. Thank you for joining and for tuning in, and have a good evening, and have a good rest of the week, and hopefully see you Sunday morning at 10 o'clock.